The Earth is their property. They are in custody of it. This kind of goes back to the work of Charles Fort, who wrote in the very early part of the 20th century in his book of the Damned and New Lands, where he sort of speculated as to exactly that all of these strange phenomena that he was finding even back then led him to conclude that the Earth was a possession. The people who were flying around in these objects, they were extraterrestrial in origin, and that in some way that through some secret method or through some secret societies, humankind was being directed by them. And so I just gave it the term custodian, and then I follow throughout history. I kind of go way back to when in ancient Sumeria and in the ancient religions they were talking about how they had these human-like gods who came down from the skies. They were the controllers or the leaders of the human race. The human race was at best a slave race at that time. And then they talk about, in some of the texts, a way to keep control, and that is to breed factions. You have one group of people fight another group of people. And that's one way to basically keep control over all of them. That's something that Machiavelli wrote about in The Prince, Gods of Eden. The book came out back in '89, and at the time I thought, okay, well, it'll be interesting to see if the theory holds up, because back in '89 the Iron Curtain was coming down, the communist bloc was breaking up, which I thought was a very positive thing, and I still do. But then I noticed, though, that there were still these little flare-ups involving Islam. Either in '89 or '90, I was giving a talk, and people were asking me, well, do you think this is really true? Because, look, we seem to be now entering the age of Aquarius. We have this great struggle ending between the West and communism. And I thought, well, okay, this will be an interesting test, but if the Gods of Eden is true, my prediction is that Islam will become the next great faction to actually breed hot war. What I thought was happening was that the West versus communism wasn't really breeding a lot of hot war anymore. Hot meaning actual armed conflict. We had the Vietnam War, that ended. We had some little thing in Angola, but it really wasn't generating a lot of real armed conflict. Now we have another faction that I trace in my book also to the UFO phenomenon, and that's Islam, which now has become the faction that is helping to breed more hot war with actual violence.
If non-humans have been manipulating human life on the planet for centuries and are behind the wars, including the United States presence in Iraq right now, what is it that the non-humans want?
Well, that's an awfully good question. From my point of view, at least in doing Gods of Eden, I feel like I'm kind of at that point where there seems to be some evidence here, but I don't know that I totally understand the motive. Other than the human race, I think Charles Fort, again, back in the early 1900s, says that we have the equivalent status of cattle or sheep, or not a very flattering point of view, and I'm not sure I share that exactly.
Meaning that we are owned by something, monitored by something, and used by something.
Yeah, exactly, and that was his theory. That seems to be holding up, that basically we're still a possession, and the means of holding onto that possession are simply being followed like they were before. Now, if you go back to the old creation stories, it was real obvious. Human beings were engineered essentially to do labor, to toil in the mines, to get mineral substances for the gods and keep them fed, keep them housed. What happened, though, is it became less obvious because the UFOs, they didn't disappear. They simply kind of went into the background. They started following more of a Machiavellian pattern. So then we have to ask, okay, they're no longer here just out in the open like people were claiming they were before, out in the open saying, okay, go ahead and build this pyramid for us and do this for that. So what's the motive now? And here I guess you have to kind of look at maybe the abduction testimony. There seems to be some kind of breeding program. There still seems to be activity related to genetics, and what that might be, gosh, I don't know.
War is an event that causes a lot of death. Is it possible that death itself is one of the goals by non-humans?
I feel there's good evidence for it. The soul or the spirit is separable from the body. I mean, that's an idea that goes way back. Christians express it. Pretty much most religions express it. They just have a different idea of what happens to the soul after death. So I think that concept in itself is valid. I think the near-death research that people have done confirms that. or provides evidence for it. I know there's a lot of dispute about this, by the way. There's people who don't think that's what it is, but I do. And so the process of death seems to involve the soul leaving the body at death, going through some kind of amnesia process, and then being reborn. And that's the old idea of reincarnation that was especially expressed by the Hindus. The Mormons express that idea also in some of their writings. So we find that this concept is very strong in a lot of religions. It's not so popular in Christianity anymore, but in other religions, the idea of being reborn is. And it's that whole thing about dying, having amnesia, and being reborn that seems to further this agenda. Because one thing that I noticed, too, is that in the UFO phenomena that we read about today, a lot of the abductees, they seem to actually be given commands, or there's some kind of mental process that's inflicted on them by their captors to make them forget. And so the ability or the technology of the UFO to instill amnesia on human beings seems to be very much there and be part of their practice. So the question is this being done on a very large scale? So that's where death might fit in, because if we keep forgetting that we are souls and we keep kind of getting recycled over and over again, thinking that we're not, it keeps that aspect of being imprisoned here, which is something the Gnostics talked about, the Essenes talked about, the imprisonment aspect of human life.
If reincarnation is the machinery of the universe, and that there are non-human intelligences that are focused on reincarnation here on Earth, meaning the recycling of a spiritual soul body in and out of containers over a long period of time, which might even explain dividing the population into different religious perspectives on purpose to make them war with each other. And here's the speculation: because war causes death, and death would lead to the souls having to recycle.
I never thought of that, and I think that's really interesting. Yeah, war certainly would contribute to that, just like disease would and any other cause of death and old age. So these are all things that factor in. But yeah, certainly war does, and it does it in an especially violent way. And I'd have to wonder, is there a difference in how people experience death differently, or the soul experience differently, if they suffered violently or if they suffered gradually through a disease or just the effects of old age? Does that serve a purpose? Does that fit into a program some way?
If the manipulation of one or more non-human intelligences still has a grip on what is happening to human life and politics of Earth, what is it that perpetuates this hold on the Earth, and what do they want?
What they want, the furthest that I can go, is business as usual. The patterns we're seeing today are exactly the patterns we saw thousands of years ago. It just hasn't changed. But these underlying forces still continue to go on, meaning that whatever society the UFO society is, they probably have a different perception of time than we do. To them, maybe 1,000 years is like 20 years to us. And so this can be sustained longer. And again, this is speculation too.
But what do you speculate are the agendas of these custodians, as you describe them?
Just to keep Earth as a possession as it's always been. And whatever, to quote Charles Fort, whatever our quote-unquote mysterious usefulness might be, we still have that usefulness. We still have that same usefulness we had 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. I guess it's just the nature of a society or a country that once you have a colony, you just hang on to it, even if it really doesn't maybe do you a whole lot of good anymore. You just manage it the same way. You just keep it the same way. And that might be all that there is to this. And to me, the use of a Machiavellian technique is simply a technique of management.